Did the CIA's quest for mind control accidentally start the Age of Aquarius? Welcome back to part 2 of the MK Ultra series. We can't talk about 1960s counterculture without bringing up Timothy Leary, a Harvard psychologist and researcher who became interested in psychedelics after reading a Life magazine article written by Robert Gordon Wasson titled Seeking the Magic Mushroom, about his journey to Mexico, where he found a shaman priestess named Maria Sabina, where she introduced him to magic mushrooms. Little did Wasson know, his little psychedelic journey was being funded by the CIA, by Sidney Gottlieb, who I'm sure you remember from part 1. So Timothy Leary took his own quest to Mexico to find these little magic mushrooms for himself. It was later revealed in Stephen Kinzer's book that Sidney Gottlieb also funded Timothy Leary's trip to Mexico. When Leary came back, he conducted an experiment called the Concord Prison Experiment. He gave prisoners mushrooms in an attempt to rehabilitate them. Now, Wasson's day job was in banking. He was the vice president of public relations for JP Morgan. But when the CIA found out about his discoveries in Mexico, they had Dr. James Moore, who was a University of Delaware chemist that secretly worked for the CIA, befriend Wasson and go down to Mexico with him to find the mushrooms. And again, we see another crossover with Operation Paperclip, where Nazi scientists were brought over to the US. One of these scientists, Fritz Hoffman, worked closely with Dr. James Moore, where they traveled the world to find new and exotic ways to poison people. Now, when Timothy Leary came back from Mexico with the mushrooms, he worked closely with another Harvard psychologist, Richard Alpert, who later became Ram Dass, known for the book Be Here Now. Now, if you remember from the last part, Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann discovered LSD. Sidney Gottlieb bought every dose of it in the world. Many of the subjects were given it against their will. They also wanted to know what would happen if it was given to people willingly. This is where they infiltrated the anti-war hippie movement. They conducted the most infamous part of MK Ultra out of Stanford University. One of the volunteers was Ken Kesey. At the time was a student at Stanford. He actually enjoyed the LSD so much that he started working there. And the things that he saw and experienced there led him to write the novel One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Another one of these LSD volunteers out of Stanford was Allen Ginsberg, who was a poet part of the Beat Generation. And he was actually given LSD by Gottlieb himself. It's also said that William S. Burroughs volunteered to take the LSD as well. Another one of the Stanford volunteers was Robert Hunter of the Grateful Dead. Now back to Ken Kesey. He started to pass the LSD around outside of work and started to develop a bit of a cult following called the Merry Pranksters. And along with his followers, he started to conduct experiments at his house called the La Honda experiments. Now all of this was very well documented in the Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, a book by Tim Wolfe, who actually started gonzo journalism. So then Ken Kesey and his followers bought a bus named Further, painted it in psychedelic colors, and went on a cross-country road trip from California to New York to perform these acid tests on people all over the country. Now, the YouTube page Gnostic Media actually shared an audio recording of Timothy Leary saying our undercover agents in Los Angeles were very laid back. They were never as public as some other, the buses running around the country, implying that Timothy Leary himself might have been an undercover agent, and also seemingly implying that Ken Kesey was an undercover agent. Now, in a 1980 phone interview with Jerry Garcia from the Grateful Dead, he talks about how the Merry Pranksters approached him and asked them to be part of these acid tests. Now, these acid tests, which were originally held in Ken Kesey's house, then continued all across the country, where after dosing people with LSD, they would manipulate the lights and the sounds, and even create sensory experiences, not only to observe people's behavior, but to achieve intersubjectivity. Now, we have subjective experiences and objective experiences. Intersubjectivity is somewhere in between, where you can have an individual experience. It is also a communal experience with other people in the room. Now, in another interview, Bob Weir, also a member of Grateful Dead, there's a lot of members of Grateful Dead, talks about being approached by Bill Quinn, who in the interview he says was a member of OSS and the CIA. However, officially, there's only information about him being part of the Army and working in aerospace. In that same interview, Bob Weir is asked about, he's questioned about the Grateful Dead performing at the Bohemian Grove, where he says he didn't notice anything weird. Now, it's obvious that the Grateful Dead was surrounded by CIA, but we can only wonder if any of them were actually members. But the lyrics to their song, US Blues, say, "I'm Uncle Sam, that's who I am. Been hiding out in a rock and roll band." And this goes back to that Leary recording, talking about the undercover agents being so public on the bus. Could he have been implying some of the members of the Grateful Dead? Now, in 1966, these acid tests came to an end. For Ken Kesey and his cult following, an acid test graduation was held on Halloween night, 1966. Ken Kesey said, "It's time to move on." And Neil Cassidy, another figure of the Beat Generation, handed out diplomas. They told people it was time to stop dropping acid and going to concerts. Later in his life, Timothy Leary was quoted saying, "The CIA sponsored the consciousness movement and the counterculture events of the 1960s. He was arrested several times in the following years, and once his friends came to visit him and brought him a Bible. However, the Bible had been soaked in LSD. In 1970, he escaped from prison and was later found in Afghanistan. Other notable moments during this time, when John Lennon was asked about LSD, he said, "Make sure you thank the CIA for that." Now, what's interesting, later on in the 90s, when other MKUltra victims started to come forward and say that the program did not end, several of them expressed that part of their programming used Beatles songs and how certain songs were programmed to make them react in certain ways. We're going to get into the Monarch programming later in this series. Other theories of this time include Jim Morrison of The Doors, whose father was in the Navy, but believed to be connected to intelligence programs as well as Frank Zappa, whose father was a military chemist, also believed to be connected to intelligence. John Phillips of the Mamas and the Papas, whose father was in the Marine Corps, but also rumored to be connected to intelligence. Okay, so stay tuned for part 3, where we're going to be talking about George White, whose letter he wrote on his deathbed is, oh my God. We're going to be talking about Operation Midnight Climax, where the CIA opened their own brothels for MKUltra experiments.